Hey MaestroDMX community, we're super stoked to announce the release of software version 1.3. In this update, we've got lots of cool new features, including changes to the way trigger buttons work and the ability to configure them. Also, we've added a new core pattern named FlashBang. It's kind of like a strobe, but way more interesting. We've also added two new dynamic attributes. These are attributes that are controlled by Maestro. One of them is zoom, so you can control zoom of your lights now. And also we've mapped activity level to any DMX channel that you want for creative control of your fixtures. And finally, we've got a whole bunch of new controls possible over MIDI. So you can use a third-party MIDI controller to control a lot more of Maestro. Okay, let's dive into it. All right, one of the biggest differences you'll notice with software version 1.3 of MaestroDMX are the changes to the trigger effects buttons. You now have the ability to configure some of the buttons and also to decide if you want to function in momentary mode or latched mode. So let's talk about momentary versus latched to start. So currently in the 1.2 software, you'll notice that you have to press down this button for the effect to happen. So for instance, if you want the blinder to happen, you have to keep it pressed down. Now with 1.3, you have the ability to latch that button. So if you click this circle and make it green, that means when you hit this button, the blinder, for example, that blinder effect will stay on until you press that button again. So I can turn it off by pressing the button. And the latching option is controlled by clicking the circle here. So you can see that I can latch the blackout, the blinder, the fog, and the effect. So when I press this effect now, that's going to stay down, and you can see that it's triggered by the yellow color in the flame there. If I hit the fog, you can tell that that's depressed because the fog lights up. And same with blinder, and same with the blackout. And then you can unlatch by again hitting that circle. The next big update to the trigger buttons is the ability to configure them. So for strobe, for example, you can now set the strobe brightness and the flash rate. So to get to that menu, I just clicked on this arrow next to the button. The strobe brightness can be controlled here, and the flash rate can be controlled here. I'll talk about this in more detail, but these controls are now connected to the MIDI input specification for Maestro, so you can control them from a third-party MIDI controller. Moving on to blinder, if you click the button to the side of blinder, you can now control the blinder brightness. And then fog has a few more options. So we have as well as a fog on-off attribute, there is now a fog volume attribute that some fog machines have. So you can connect that fog volume attribute if your haze or fog machine has that volume attribute in its specification. And then you now have the ability to run it in continuous mode or timer mode. So if it's in continuous mode, while this button is pressed, the fog or the haze or whatever is attached to that attribute of fog on off will turn on. However, in timer mode, it will run on a cyclical timer where you set the interval and duration. So the interval is the spacing in between the bursts of when it turns on, and the duration is how long it turns on for. So for instance, if I want my fog to turn on for say 2.5 minutes, and then I want to turn off for 1 minute, I would set the interval to 1 so that it's off for a minute, and then duration to 2.5 minutes. So then it's going to be on for 2.5 minutes. And then it's just going to cycle in that 2-minute duration and 1-minute interval until you turn the button off. So there's a lot more control here for fogs and hazers. So that concludes the configuration for the buttons. And let me just show you the attributes for fog and fog volume that have changed. So if I go over to my stage, I could add a new add a fixture I'm just going to add a custom fixture to the stage with 2 channels. I'm going to call it Fog Machine. Put it on the primary fixture group. So my Fog Machine popped up down here with 2 channels. So let's say that my first channel is fog volume and my second is on off. For my fog volume, I would simply find the fog volume attribute. And for the fog on off, I would find my fog on off attribute. I will make sure if I edit the channel on fog on off, I will make sure that the off value and the on value is set to where I want it to be. So off is 0, on is 255, and I'll save it. And now going back to show, this slider here is now connected to that DMX channel that was set as fog volume. And then when the fog turns on, it's going to set the on value of that channel that had fog on off set as its attribute. Okay. And you also now have the ability to, at the fixture group level, toggle on off these effects. So for instance, on fixture group 1, right here over in live mode, you'll see you have allow strobe trigger, allow blackout trigger, blinder trigger, fog trigger, and effect trigger. And the same toggles are available for the secondary fixture group and the third fixture group, which I don't have any fixtures on my third fixture group at the moment, so you don't see it pop up here. But if you had fixtures on the third, you would also have the tertiary fixture group. So if we jump back to primary, I can, for instance, turn off strobing on my primary fixture group and have it only show up on the other fixture groups that have allowed the strobing. And likewise with all the other trigger buttons. So maybe I wanted an effect to happen just on my first fixture group and not on my second. I would jump over to my second group, turn that effect off. So this gives you a lot more power on how those buttons are going to work and show up on your stage. With Software 1.3, we've also introduced a new core pattern called FlashBang. Search FlashBang here. So just to reiterate, we have core patterns and Maestro patterns. The Maestro patterns are the intelligent patterns that move through different effects and different sequences based on the music and different color palettes within the color palette groups. And the core patterns are like just essentially one-trick ponies. These are just patterns that don't change their effects, but can be sound responsive and also won't change the color palette that they use. So if you pick a color palette group for a core pattern, it will just randomly assign a color palette to that core pattern. So for FlashBang, let's say I can pick I just want it to be cool white. Like all core patterns, I have the ability to control the brightness. It has the ability to react to music or not. If it's not reacting to music, then it essentially is a strobe pattern that flashes at a rate that is controlled by the speed. The energy is how bright that flash is. The variance is the background level. So if you put the variance all the way up, you get the most contrast. So basically the flash will go on and then everything else will turn off. If you put the variance down, you'll have a bit of background light level. So it will calm the strobe effect. And decay is how quickly that flash will die off. So if you want it to be very short and snappy, you turn the decay down. If you want that flash to decay down a bit slower, you can turn the decay up. It also has some effect on the attack of that flash. So that's without audio activity on. If you turn audio activity on, the flashbang pattern reacts to kick drums. So if the kick drum triggers are found in the music, the lights will flash when the kick hits. If there's no kick drums and we're in a breakdown, the lights will flash to just onsets of the music. So an onset is something like a guitar chord that's played really strongly, or a hi-hat hit, or maybe some percussive element. So if the kick drums are happening, the kick drums will be triggering the flashes. And if they're not happening, onsets will be triggering the flashes. The speed is a threshold. So lower the speed, the essentially the more sensitive it will be at picking up the onsets or the kick drum, so it lowers the threshold required to exceed for it to trigger. If you increase the threshold, it won't be as sensitive. The energy again is how bright that flash is when it hits, and the variance is the background level like before, and the decay like before is how that flash decays off. So that explains the new FlashBang pattern. Hope you enjoy it. You have a lot of controls over it. And now let's move over to the new dynamic attributes that have been added to software 1.3. So if I jump over to my stage, I have 2 Martin Mac Aura lights and 2 gig bar moves. So the first dynamic attribute that we've added is autonomous zoom. So a dynamic attribute is an attribute that gets controlled by Maestro, and a static attribute is one that just maintains a static value over the life of your stage. Dynamic attributes are DMX attributes like RGB and pan and tilt and those things that Maestro controls. So if we look at this Mac Aura over here, I'll expand its profile out and I can look at all the channels, and you'll notice that on channel 3 there's a zoom, and that makes the light get bigger or smaller. Currently that zoom is set to static value. So what you can do now is go in and change your zoom channels to the zoom attributes. If I click on that and hit Z, I'll be given zoom. There's also zoom fine that's been added for those fixtures that do have 16-bit control over the zoom channel. So I'll add that to zoom. You now no longer see a value here because it's not a static value. So now Maestro will intelligently control the pulsating, like the shape of that beam as it zooms in and out. So that'll just add a bit more dynamic to your lights that have zoom. Furthermore, oh yeah, so we don't currently have zoom added into the fixture profiles in the library, or the ones that you're going to be getting once you request from us. That's coming very soon. We're going to be adding zoom to the fixture library. In the meantime, you can just add zoom manually by this way that I showed you, either in the fixture profile, in the fixture profile page. So I could go to my Mac Aura and I could duplicate that fixture and I could modify it at this high level so that when it gets put on the stage, and I'll go back to stage here, it will show up. Or you can just do it stage by expanding out your fixture and connecting it to zoom. The second new attribute is activity. So activity is just a direct mirror of the activity level that you see over here on the audio page. So when I've got audio going into Maestro, you'll see that it measures the activity or the excitement of the music. You now have that as a direct control to any DMX channel. If I go back to my stage, so you may be wondering, like, what can I map activity level to? Well, that's up to you in terms of how you want to get creative with activity level control. But for example, I could take a gig bar move here, the 35 channel, expand it out. And if I go down, I could see, oh, there's a rotation for the Derby 1. I could go over there and just find the activity attribute, connect it to the rotation. So as the music gets more energetic and more exciting, that Derby is going to rotate more. So that's one way to use activity. I'd be interested to see how you guys use it. Keep in mind, we are going to be working on a rotation attribute in the future that will probably take care of all the rotations and the directions and the speeds of the rotations. But in the meantime, you do have activity level to play with to modify the rotations of your fixtures and whatever else you could think of how to use that activity level. And then as we talked before, we do have the new fog volume as well as the fog on-off attribute. We had fog on-off before, it was just called fog. Now it's called fog on-off, and there's also fog volume. Okay, and then finally, we've made a bunch of additions to the MIDI input specification, meaning that you can control way more things in Maestro from a third-party MIDI controller. So the biggest thing is being able to now use MIDI to control global brightness. So you can just have a slider on your MIDI controller and turn the brightness of your whole stage on and off. You can now also control the parameters. If I go down and pick a Maestro pattern, so if I pick energetic, for instance, I have a set of parameters: brightness, excitement, background, mover range, mover speed. You can now control each of your fixture groups parameters, your brightness, excitement, background, mover range, and mover speed with your MIDI controller. So there's a lot of control there if you want it. Maybe you just want to control the brightness of your fixture groups for a MIDI controller, and that's totally doable. Maybe you want to go a bit further, control the brightness and the excitement level, so you could nudge the excitement through the course of the performance, however you like to do it. So we've given you a lot more control. In 1.2, we introduced the ability to build multiple shows and save multiple shows. With the MIDI controller now, you can skip to the next or previous show. So if you have a few different shows for your night, you can use a MIDI controller to jump between them. And then there are some additional controls for the trigger buttons. So we now have MIDI control for the trigger button configuration. For instance, the strobe brightness and the strobe flash rate are under MIDI control. So meaning that you could be triggering the strobe from MIDI and then control the flash rate for a build, for instance, if your track is building an energy and you want to increase the flashes. Likewise, the blinder brightness is also now on MIDI control, and so are the various parameters of the fog effect, of the fog trigger button. Just a note that the continuous parameters like global brightness, strobe brightness, flash rate, etc., and the parameters are on control change messages. These are CC control change messages for MIDI, and the more discrete clickable effects like the trigger buttons and playing of the different cues and also transport controls are on note on messages from MIDI. So you'll see the introduction of control changes for the first time in the MIDI spec. Okay, that's pretty much it. Enjoy 1.3, and just so you know, we're here in the background working super hard on 1.4, and that's gonna have effects palettes in it. And we're very excited because that's gonna unleash a whole universe of power for the more advanced users of MaestroDMX. Thanks again for all your support. It's been a slice. Take care.